For those of you who don't know me, I'm Melanie O'Brien, and I am the manager of the National NAGPRA program. As I mentioned, I started with the program just about 10 years ago, and I've been the manager for the last 6 years. Shannon and AAIA have asked me to provide a back to basics, a NAGPRA 101, as just a sort of refresher for many of you, but it looks like for a good number of you, some new introductions to this work in repatriation. I do want to encourage you to please ask questions in the Q&A. Hopefully, I will do my best to monitor those and answer them as I can, or pass them off to somebody to answer as we go forward. And also, remember, you can raise your hand if you'd like to engage with me directly on a question or an issue. I very much enjoyed the opportunity to have a welcome and have a kickoff for this conference. It's one thing I really miss about meeting in person is that ability to connect and reconnect really with our purpose for being here. And that the welcome really helped me to do that, and I hope that it helped you as well. I have prepared some slides for today, just so that it can give you something to refer to. I'm happy to make these available to you, so don't feel like you have to write everything down, and also put in lots of time for questions. So I do hope that you can engage either in the Q&A or by raising your hand as we go along. So first, to start out where I think a lot of people end, and that is what I'm hoping you'll get out of this session today, as well as resources for you to learn more about NAGPRA. Really, my goal today is to explain the letter of the law, as well as the intent behind it, but also to look at where there is discretion and decision in the process. This is a presentation that I've given before, and in fact, very similar to what I presented last year at this conference. I will, as I talk through, hopefully provide a little bit more guidance to those of you who work for Indian tribes or Native Hawaiian organizations. This is largely a presentation built around museum and federal agency responsibilities, because that's how the law itself is written, around those responsibilities. But hopefully we can also I can also point to places that can assist tribes and NHOs in making requests under NAGPRA. So for resources, if you're not familiar with our website, please check it out. It is nps.gov for National Park Service /NAGPRA. And I'll put that in the chat. We have lots of information there. In fact, we tried to write the website really to be a how-to guide. So getting started is a great place to go if you're new to this work. We also have outlined all the different aspects of the law on each of the different pages. In addition, under Law and Policy on our website, you will find the law itself, as well as the 2 congressional reports on NAGPRA. And this is where we really look to both what the letter of the law is, what the words are in the act itself, and then what Congress said they meant through the 2 congressional reports. The other source that we have are the regulations. And again, if you're not familiar with NAGPRA, having a copy of the law and a copy of the regulations can be very helpful, although I will admit many people find it to be intimidating, especially if reading regulatory and legal language is not your preferred form of reading. But just to give you a sense for what the regulations are, those are the interpretations by the Department of the Interior, and in particular, the Secretary of the Interior, on what the law means and how the law will be carried out. All regulations go through a process where regulations are proposed first, then the government seeks public comment on those proposals, and then issues a final rule. And NAGPRA has gone through that process a number of times. And as you may be aware, we are looking at starting that process again in the near future with a new proposed rule that would revise the existing regulations for NAGPRA. And as you saw in the welcome session, we heard from two of the assistant secretaries at the Department of the Interior. So as you may or may not be familiar with, here's a bit of an organizational chart so you can understand both who they were and who they report to, but also who I am in terms of organization. So both Assistant Secretary Estenos and whose name I spelled wrong on this slide, please don't, I'll fix that, and Assistant Secretary Newland, who you heard from earlier today, report and work for the Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland. They are political appointees. They go through a confirmation process in the Senate before taking this position. In addition, below the Assistant Secretary Estenos is the Director of the National Park Service. We do not currently have a confirmed Director of the National Park Service. That process is still underway in the Senate, but we do have an acting director. And then below that is the sort of first line of career staff, and that is my boss, who is the Associate Director for the National Park Service. And that's who I report to directly on a day-to-day basis. And I am the program manager of the National NAGPRA program. But it's important to know that the work that I do and the work that my staff does is really to carry out the Secretary's responsibilities under NAGPRA. We report directly to the Assistant Secretaries on some issues, and work with the Secretary's office on some issues as well. I have on this slide kind of delegated or highlighted some of the delegated responsibilities. The Secretary of the Interior is still responsible for appointments to the NAGPRA Review Committee. Other than that, the responsibilities under the Act have been delegated, some to the Assistant Secretary, some to the Director of the Park Service, and then largely my office handles administrative and staff support for those responsibilities. Okay, so that's just a little bit of an overview and kind of an introduction to me. I will say that one of my delegated responsibilities is to provide technical assistance to Indian tribes, NHOs, and museums and federal agencies on NAGPRA and complying with NAGPRA. So my staff and I are here to help. We are here to assist you with whatever questions, issues you might have related to NAGPRA. And to start that, I wanted to give you a sort of back to basics understanding of the law. And again, what we look to at the Department of the Interior and at the National NAGPRA program is both the law itself as well as the two congressional reports that talk about why NAGPRA was passed in 1990. So in really looking at what the purpose of this law is, it is about repatriation very central to the purpose of NAGPRA, is the process of repatriation as well as protection, the two words in the title of the law itself. And of course, as it relates to Native Americans. In looking at the process itself, how repatriation or transfer occurs under the law and the regulations, you can basically think of the process in three parts. First and foremost is consultation. After that, or in addition to that consultation, during that consultation effort is a task of identifying and reporting on Native American human remains and cultural items. And then finally, every process under NAGPRA requires giving notice, public notice, prior to repatriation or transfer. So if we break down the process a little bit, and again, I've tailored these to really look at the process for Native American human remains and funerary objects. There is a similar but slightly different process for other kinds of cultural items under NAGPRA. But to kind of limit our view today and to talk a little bit more discreetly, I'm looking here at the procedures and the process for Native American human remains and funerary objects. And again, this is a kind of summary of what you'll find in the law itself and in the regulations. You'll find a variation of this as well on our website in more of a kind of plain language version. And you know, I've done a lot of these trainings and attended a lot of NAGPRA trainings, and I really feel like sometimes we need to step away a little bit from the specific language of the act or the regulations and talk about the purpose. And really what I've done here is tried to highlight what the purpose of these different parts of NAGPRA, of the process, are. And I'd like to talk through them just a little bit. Again, a reminder that you can put questions in the Q&A, as well as raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question directly. So if we look first at the inventory process under NAGPRA, this process is to identify both the geographical and cultural affiliation of each item, and each item here means Native American human remains and funerary objects. So the purpose of an inventory is to identify that affiliation. It should be done based on available information, which includes consultation. And an inventory is intended to provide clear descriptions so that it can facilitate repatriation. So a lot of times when I talk with museum professionals about the inventory process, they have in their minds a kind of inventory that's often discussed in curatorial practices. A NAGPRA inventory is not that. A NAGPRA inventory is precisely to facilitate repatriation. It is to explain your collections. It is to provide information to Indian tribes and NHOs so that the repatriation process can move forward. And really the purpose of that inventory is for transparency. Congress told us that the inventory and notice process was really about the exchange of information. This is a way by which museums and federal agencies make clear what items they have in their control and in their holdings and collections, and what information they have about them. And this first step in the exchange of information is through the inventory process. In addition, every part of the NAGPRA process involves consultation. Museums and federal agencies must consult with Indian tribes and NHOs before they complete an inventory of human remains and funerary objects. And that consultation should be related to cultural affiliation or a geographic affiliation as the inventory process requires. During consultation, it's important that not only information about collections is shared, but also information about other consulting parties, what the project, what the time frame for making decisions is, as well as identifying any additional documentation that might be requested. The purpose of the consultation under NAGPRA is really to reach agreement. Congress told us that they intended repatriation to include and require consultation so that, again, to facilitate repatriation through the negotiation of agreement between parties. So really the purpose of consultation is to get to that agreement. Next, I've outlined here the cultural affiliation process under NAGPRA. Basically, the three elements that are required to make a cultural affiliation under NAGPRA, and that is the presence of a present-day Indian tribe or NHO, and again, there may be multiple. The identification of an earlier group, and again, there might be multiple earlier groups. And then a relationship of shared group identity between the two groups, between the present-day tribe and the earlier group. That is the process for cultural affiliation under NAGPRA. And again, I think it's important to remember that this concept of cultural affiliation is unique and particular to NAGPRA. There are other concepts of cultural connection, of cultural affinity, that you might find if you were studying anthropology. But that's not what Congress intended. Congress intended there to be a connection between the objects and the recipients of those objects. Really, the purpose of cultural affiliation, as Congress told us, was to ensure a reasonable connection. There is no requirement here of any kind of certainty, of any kind of academic standards for that connection. It is merely a reasonable connection between a present-day group and the objects that are in a holding or collection. And lastly, I've outlined some of the preponderance of the evidence process. And again, I think it's important to note here that the preponderance of the evidence process is what Indian tribes and NHOs can use in making claims and requests to museums and federal agencies for repatriation. If cultural affiliation is not determined by a museum in its inventory, then the preponderance of the evidence is the process by which a tribe could show that there's information, more information than not, that there is a cultural affiliation, that there is that connection. There are certain lines of evidence that can and should be used, as well as it's very clear that missing information is not weighable. The absence of information is not itself a weight against affiliation. Rather, there may be reasonable gaps of information and still a preponderance of the evidence for affiliation can be met. Often when I talk about preponderance, it's a big word. Maybe it sounds very legal, but it's really not. It's meant to be a simple, more likely than not. And the purpose that Congress gave us for this is more impartiality in the process of determining affiliation. Congress knew that it might be difficult or even impossible in some circumstances to show continuity between past peoples and present day peoples. So they didn't require it. There is no requirement for any kind of continuity from the past to the present. Merely what is necessary is more likely than not that there is a connection. So with that, I'm going to pause here for some questions. And I see that I already have one question in the Q&A. So I'll go ahead and read that and then respond to it. If you'd like to ask a question, you're welcome to do so in the Q&A, or you can raise your hand and we can have a conversation. I've built in lots of time for this, so please take advantage of it. The question we have from Judy Shapiro is, what are the implications of the term available information? In other words, if information is limited, should that be an impediment to reaching an agreement regarding affiliation? That's a good question, Judy, and I think that it boils down to the implications of available actually mean that there is no requirement to do more than look at what is available. Wednesday, I'm presenting a session with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, where I'm going to talk specifically about available information. And often museums or federal agencies feel that they need to find more information to be able to identify affiliation or come to an agreement. But what Congress told us is that a museum and federal agency needs to make those decisions based on available information, meaning what they have on file. And it doesn't matter if what you have on file may not be accurate. It's the available information. Now, if you know that something is inaccurate, then you certainly have an obligation to try to resolve that inaccuracy, or in your effort to weigh evidence, you might take that into consideration. But what is clear in the congressional record is that there's no requirement to do more. There's no requirement to gather more information, either through data analysis or scientific study. To that point, I would say that, I myself was educated in public history and museums, and I worked for a very small historical society as a part of my graduate school education. And I remember very clearly what the card catalogs were like that recorded the collections of that small historical society. The card catalog information is sufficient if that is the information that you have. There's no requirement to gather more information. In many cases, we have field notes or journals that accompany collections. That is a part of the available information. But there's no requirement to meet some threshold of information. What is necessary is that decisions are made based on that available information. So I'm just looking here and I don't have any other questions. Trying to figure out how I mark this as answered. I don't see that option either. Okay, we have another question here. Can a museum delay or deny a valid claim from lineal descendants for funerary objects if the institution believes there should be more lineal descendants than provided in the claim? Well, this one, is a bit complicated and requires, I think, first a little bit of discussion, especially for those of you who may be new to this. Lineal descent or lineal descendants under NAGPRA are people who can trace a direct ancestry to the human remains or funerary objects in question, and a present-day lineal descendant. Now, that descent, that ancestry, can be traced through sort of common law practices of descent or through other traditional kinship methods. And that kind of gets to the answer to your question. A claim from a lineal descendant would need to be evaluated for the claim, for the connection between the person making the claim and the funerary objects in this case, or human remains in other cases. Certainly, it's perhaps unlikely that there would be only one lineal descendant. Certainly, depending on how many generations we're talking about, there's more than likely several people who are connected. And while there should be an effort to be sure that those other descendants, if they're known, are notified of the claim, there would be no reason to not follow through on a repatriation in the absence of additional claims. So certainly, if there is a valid claim from a lineal descendant, after consultation, certainly with the lineal descendant as well as any related tribes or NHOs, and an effort to contact other lineal descendants, the process should move forward. Now, there is a process by which a museum could deny a claim from a lineal descendant if they don't meet the criteria. And again, the criteria here is that the lineal descendant can show direct ancestry, either through traditional kinship systems or through common law ancestry or other kinds of traditional kinship systems. I hope that answers your question. And certainly feel free to follow up. All right, we have several questions. Can a museum use a possible error in their cataloging system to deny repatriation of human remains? It's an interesting question, and I think I might need to know a little bit more. It would depend on what the error indicates or what the information is about the collection. So first and foremost, a museum is responsible for identifying Native American human remains. And again, the catalog system would be a source of that information. In addition, a museum is required to identify geographical and cultural affiliation. Again, if the error in the cataloging system somehow doesn't provide that the human remains are Native American, or that they do not have a geographical or cultural affiliation, then that could be information, but really you would need to know why is it an error. And certainly there have been more than a few cases where museums have not found collections, but through other research or identification of errors in cataloging systems have found the missing collections and have proceeded with repatriation. So I think that I'll ask you to maybe follow up with a little more specifics, or you can raise your, I see, Crystal, you've raised your hand. Let me see if I can figure out how to bring you in. I think Shannon, I may need some help. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah. Hi, Crystal.
Hi, this is Crystal Seabearing, and I work for the Northern Arapaho Tribal Historic Preservation Office. And we've been working with the Chicago Field Museum, and we did receive their inventory a few years ago regarding human remains for an ancestor that was found in our geographical location. However, when we met with them, they said their cataloging system, because they had it down as Arapaho, and it was in a box titled Arapaho, but they assumed at the time of cataloging, it was just placed in the box temporarily, and that's what they're assuming. And so based on that, they're saying it's not Arapaho, even though it was cataloged as Arapaho. And so that's why they're denying our repatriation.
Thanks for providing specifics. It's always helpful to talk through specific examples. I think in this case, what you see is that there is some information, but I would, what you could do and what the tribe maybe should do if you haven't already is ask for the information they have that shows that these are not Arapaho remains, because clearly there's something that shows it is. So is there other information to show that these are not Arapaho remains? Is there something more than something more there that gives that information to the museum to make that denial?
What they used when we did meet with them is just an analysis of the measurement of the skull, and that it didn't, and they thought it was more South American than American Indian, and that's what they were going off after they measured the skull.
So that measurements then would be an example of biological information that would be counter evidence to the collection information, that what was on the side of the box or what was identified in the catalog system. And really what it would come down to is if there is a way of identifying additional information, if there's anything else that could contribute to a better understanding of the remains, or if the tribe has information to show that measurements are inaccurate, to say, for example, or other ways that the tribe could produce information to show that it could be Arapaho.
Yeah, that's kind of what we're going for, is just saying that the measurement, we don't think it's very valid in saying if it's Arapaho or not, and then also that we were in the area where it was discovered, and so we thought that would be enough information for us to go ahead with the repatriation, and I'm hoping it goes that way. But yeah, it's just been a battle.
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm sorry, but again, I would recommend that the tribe put forward its clearest claim in terms of preponderance of the evidence, or more likely than not that it's Arapaho. And it sounds like here really we've got a couple pieces of information that you could provide, and that's the geographical information as well as the catalog information. And then request that the museum demonstrate to you that it's more likely not Arapaho than it is likely Arapaho, if that makes sense. It comes down to a matter of the likelihood. And I understand a lot of times museum professionals, one piece of doubt could, or information to show doubt could stop the process, but that's not really what was intended by NAGPRA and by Congress. And again, maybe that could be a way of approaching the issue with the museum, to have them explain why it's more likely not Arapaho when the tribe feels it's more likely Arapaho.
Thank you.
Sure. And I will encourage those of you out there who may have some advice for Crystal on measurements or other kinds of counter arguments to that biological information. There's ways to reach out across this digital platform, and I would encourage you to do that. I'm going to back up here a little bit. Thank you, Crystal, for joining me and asking your question. Let let me go back a little bit here. Could traditional knowledge, biocultural notices, or more generally metadata and meta layers, or open educational resources be used to establish cultural affiliation? Certainly, traditional lines of information or traditional knowledge should be used in identifying cultural affiliation. And that might take a lot of forms. I'm not sure sort of how to categorize some of the information you've proposed here, but I think all information should be used, whatever the source of that information, to establish cultural affiliation. So that would include any kind of information that might provide insight to connection. We have another question here on whether a re-inventory of a collection is necessary, and if so, to what detail. For example, if catalog cards do not exist or do not provide information on the types or counts of objects. So I think that to answer this question about a re-inventory, you need to look back at what the purpose of an inventory is. And that purpose, remember, is transparency and to facilitate repatriation. So whether or not a museum should re-inventory a collection should really be a question for consultation and what will facilitate repatriation. Because really, the only way to answer that is to first get input from Indian tribes or NHOs. You have a responsibility as a museum to identify the types of funerary objects, at least in general. And in terms of counting, you do have to assign them a number, but that number could be through any kind of way you might count to identify them. So for example, often we recommend that museums use lots as opposed to counting individual specific pieces as a easier process by which to proceed to inventory and notice. And certainly when it comes to human remains, the requirement is to identify individual sets of human remains to the extent you can. And again, we recommend that you think about that in terms of what the minimum is. So if you have human remains that represent at least one individual, it might be more, but it's at least one. That's a number that you can move forward with under NAGPRA, provided that's okay with the tribes. And again, that's where that consultation comes in to really get to an answer to this question. We have another question about if the National NAGPRA program has templates for memorandums of agreement on housing ancestral remains for a long term, or we don't actually. It's a really good question. And I think that it's a question best answered by this community of practitioners here. I do know that there are museums that have different kinds of agreements or curation agreements with tribes on holding collections. There's a lot of standard templates like that in the museum world. It wouldn't be a part of the NAGPRA process specifically, so we wouldn't have a template for it. But I would say that any tribe that wanted to engage in some kind of long-term curation or loan agreement with a museum, you should first make sure that the NAGPRA process is in place and complete, meaning that the tribe's rights to those objects are clearly in writing, and that the rights to those collections are resolved so that the tribe can make decisions about them. Sorry, it's a lot of talking. All right. Someone has asked to elaborate on the definition of cultural patrimony, and has the understanding of it evolved over time? It's a good question. In terms of the evolution of the term, We still have the definition that Congress gave us in 1990 for what an object of cultural patrimony is. Whether or not that has evolved, I would say certainly we have a lot of examples of what is an object of cultural patrimony. And again, this is a point where it is Indian tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations who would provide the information necessary to make an identification of an object of cultural patrimony. Certainly, the definition relies on information from tribes and NHOs in order to meet that definition of central importance to a tribe or a group. There are plenty of examples in our Federal Register notices of the kinds of objects that museums have determined to be objects of cultural patrimony. And I would encourage you, if you want to look for examples, you can use the Federal Register to do searches. It's pretty easy to type in the Federal Register and search for NAGPRA, and then either the kind of object that you're looking for or a specific location. There's lots happening in the chat that I'm not quite following, but I hope that those of you are, especially as it's responsive to some of these questions. And that goes to the next Q&A here is really about the question Crystal raised on measurements and whether there might be some precedent from the Kennewick case on the inaccuracy of measurements. And then another question is, to what extent do organizations have a legal obligation to uphold NAGPRA? Is there any legal argument for small private museums to uphold NAGPRA, and can tribes ask for items from these museums? It's a good question. Again, I think any museum that meets the definition under NAGPRA has an obligation to repatriate. And museum is very broadly defined under the law. That can mean any institution that receives federal funds and has control of Native American cultural items. So I think it's important to look a little closer at what a small private museum is and whether it might meet the definition of a museum under NAGPRA. Certainly many museums receive federal funding either through direct grant programs or sometimes through indirect means. And those certainly qualify then for museum status and a requirement to repatriate. That being said, many tribes have had success in working with truly private collections and achieving voluntary repatriations. So it is possible. And certainly we've seen this both domestically and internationally, that museums may agree to return objects even when they are not required to do so by law. And I think there'll be quite a bit more conversation on the international side of that later in the conference, I think on the 17th. Okay, I'm just following up with the chat to see if I've missed anything. And it looks like there's still a raised hand. Oh, there's some information about a care and trust agreement template on the Bernstein and Associates, available at the Bernstein and Associates booth for the conference. Veronica Passfield, you have your hand raised. Shannon or Colleen, can you? Thank you. I think you're on mute, Veronica.
Thank you so much. Quick question for you. if sometimes I find that museums don't understand exactly how to approach a summary, where they think that it's their job to determine what is NAGPRA eligible and then notify us based on that. But then when you come into consultation and you're in the collections room, you'll see other items there that are not on the summaries that actually are NAGPRA eligible, but the knowledge is not there within the museum to understand that. So I wonder if you could just speak a little bit to that and help museums and tribes understand um, kind of how broadly the reach should be with the summary. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. And again, a summary is for those items that are not human remains or funerary objects, but those other Native American cultural items that may be in a holding or collection should be reported in a summary. And I think your question, Veronica, gets to really a main and central issue with the summary process in general. And that is only through consultation can those items that fit a category, meaning they are a sacred object or an object of cultural patrimony or a funerary object, that can really only come through consultation. And so consultation is required as a part of the process leading to repatriation. And what we tell museums, and what I would encourage any of you to explain, is that it is a failure to comply with NAGPRA if you leave an object off of your summary, or if you don't notify tribes through that transparency process of a summary that you have collections that might contain one of these categories of items, and that it is only through consultation that can be identified. So if it's identified later, it could be a failure to comply for a museum to not have identified that, or to use their own judgment in determining what is a patrimony or sacred object. I'll just add to that those definitions inherently, as I said before, require consultation, because it is through the tribe's information that object can meet those definitions. So it requires that information from the tribe in order to really know what the object is. Congress realized this, and that is exactly why the process for summaries is the way that it is, where a museum is required to tell generally about its collection of Native American items, but then through the process of consultation to identify them and repatriate them accordingly. I hope that gets to your question.
It's beautifully said and very clear, miigwech.
I think maybe we have a little bit of a connection problem.
That was wonderful, miigwech, Melanie.
Sure. And again, I really encourage you to look for examples of the wide variety of items that are objects of cultural patrimony or sacred objects by looking at NAGPRA notices for those objects. There's any number of items that you may be surprised to learn have either sacred object characteristics or objects of cultural patrimony that aren't generally known, but certainly that knowledge is retained by the tribes and used in establishing those claims to those objects. I think I'm caught up on the Q&A, but we have one more raised hand. Hello, you're on.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay. I'm the one who raised the question about the museum who we had all the correspondence from. We started to do a NAGPRA complaint against them. I have to give you a little bit of the background story. There was a dugout canoe that was found in the 1950s, I think, and it allegedly had human remains in it and other items in a dugout canoe, which was sunk to the bottom of the lake. It was pulled out of the lake and then it disappeared. Long story short, it ended up in a museum in Vermont. We found out they had it, and then inadvertently, they gave us all the internal correspondence saying that they deliberately knew that they had something of a hot potato, took it out of their collections and put it into a warehouse. Somebody else found out about it and knew we were filing a complaint. We were working for the state SHPO. We're actually in New Hampshire, and this museum was in Vermont. Well, when they realized we were on to them and the fact that they had actually corresponded internally, that they knew they had an NAGPRA item that could have been considered either cultural patrimony or a burial goods, which is kind of unusual for a dugout canoe to be classified that, they deliberately unloaded it on a small nonprofit local historical society so we couldn't get our hands on it, knowing that they didn't ever take federal funding in any capacity, and yet the museum did. So we started to file a complaint, and NAGPRA representative said, you had no status because we're not a federally recognized tribe. You're a petitioning tribe, but you had no federal status. And we said that doesn't have to do with anything. There's cultural patrimony and affiliation with this item. Well, what we're trying to find out now is there a statute of limitations where this is over, where we can't continue with this claim? You know, the pandemic hit. We were kind of like tied, our hands tied behind our back to pursue and get interviews with the people along the way. So we've lost 2 years. Is this petition for complaint still valid if we go forward at this point?
Well, it's a good question, and I want to first encourage you and anyone else to attend the session about NAGPRA and enforcement. Hopefully Shannon can remind me which date that session is. I believe it's next week. And I think that I think there's a lot of good information there. There is not a clear limitation on an investigation of a failure to comply in terms of time limit. Certainly, we've seen cases that were failures to comply many years ago that were found to be a failure. So I would encourage you to not move forward based on the timing question. The question around federal recognition is another tricky one, and again, I think would require some more discussion around the case and whether there might be a connection of some other way of moving forward. But the last point I want to make, and this is broadly to everyone, and really goes back to this the intent here around NAGPRA, and that is on what you've learned by getting information from a museum. Museums are required to provide information to tribes when they are asked for it. And so there's a lot you can learn by requesting that information. And unfortunately, in this case, it sounds like what you've learned is a lot of perhaps bad dealings or bad efforts on the part of this institution. Certainly, whether or not you could move forward under the civil penalty process under NAGPRA or perhaps some other means would be more of an issue to discuss. And I would encourage all of you to remember that there are options for enforcement. They may be limited and they may unfortunately not address every issue, but there are certainly options to look at how a museum might be compelled to take care of its NAGPRA responsibilities. So I hope that answers your question. I don't want to be too specific here, just, in this kind of environment, but I would encourage you to attend that session and maybe make a connection either with me or with somebody in my office, and we can discuss the options further.
Yeah, I felt that NAGPRA was siding with the museum only on the fact that, we stand under U.S. Title 25 as self-determined, and we still petitioned. We're still on your consultation list, and yet he knew this. And your NAGPRA representative said, no, the museum doesn't have to comply. So we had to find out whether they actually took federal money at any point for their collections, and they did. So, I think this was a slam dunk. And he said, I can't practice law, but I'm siding with the museum. They don't have to do anything. And the state SHPO here in New Hampshire was kind of outraged too that he was marginalized because this event occurred in Vermont, which is the next state over. So I think there's a bigger and a broader problem here in interpretation and implementation of NAGPRA. And I just want to make sure we didn't have any statute of limitations, because I want to pursue this most aggressively, because everything in the correspondence showed, an attempt to hide this and disassociate themselves with this hot potato, as they put it, and get it into the hands of a small nonprofit. And luckily, it actually moved a lot closer to our tribal headquarters, and now is in the Lakes region of New Hampshire. But it's in a museum that's only open like 2 days out of the year. So it's kind of like a waste of space. And we had intentions of turning this over to the state for extended collections with the state. It didn't happen because of this transfer, which we think was illegal. But I'll wait for the rest of the this conference and see if anything else comes up of interest, because I was more concerned with the pandemic. We just haven't been able to pursue legal options. And, it's been tough. It's been very tough. Thank you very much for, listening to us. Gisulini, great thanks.
Sure. Thank you. I certainly understand and am far too familiar with the kind of story that you shared here, and I appreciate that. It looks like we've got some other people weighing in the chat, and AAIA in particular, and a reminder that enforcement panel is next week on November 10th. There was a question in the chat I wanted to jump back to, and that is whether there's a way to strengthen NAGPRA or other laws to extend protection to ancestors taken from private lands. And I think that, again, for those of you who are new to this, or even those of you who've been around for a while, one of the constant misstatements I hear about NAGPRA is that it only applies to federal and tribal land. And that's not the case. Certainly, things that are removed from private land, if they then become under the control of a museum, and that museum, again, could be very broadly defined to be maybe the state division of archaeology or the state archaeologist. Once those objects come under the control of a museum under NAGPRA, there are NAGPRA requirements for repatriation. Now, there are some states where a private landowner can retain a private collection and not be subject to NAGPRA. But I think really this is where state law comes into play. So as a commenter has just raised, there needs to be an understanding of these issues by state historic preservation offices and those within states that have responsibility for protection and preservation of archaeological resources. And that would include ancestors that might be on private lands. And really, you know, it's when you look at the history of repatriation law and effort, it was a large effort in actually the state of Iowa that spurred the additional federal efforts for repatriation in NAGPRA that culminated with the passage of NAGPRA. But there has to be that approach and direction at the state level as well as the federal level for the removal of those objects. All right, I'm going to move on to the next section. We have a question about a recording of this, and yes, I do believe that recordings will be available. And then there's a question about geographical affiliation and lines of evidence, and geography is one of them. And actually, thank you, because that's coming up in my putting it into practice slides, where I've tried to take these concepts of purpose and process and really put them into a do-it-yourself explanation. So really, to achieve transparency in the inventory process, it requires museums as well as tribes to really dig into the information that is available. I always recommend that a museum certainly review its inventory that we have available on our website, or that you can get more detailed information by requesting it from us. And also to then look at the records of the museum. And again, I would say that these are things that a tribe can and should request of an institution, of a museum or federal agency. Copies of their initial inventories, copies of their records of consultation, as well as copies of information about the collection. Here is a screenshot of our website and the inventory page, where you can sort by geographic location or affiliation or institution. Certainly had lots of examples of tribes who've used this database to be able to identify collections that they are interested in making requests for based on geographic location, state and county information that is available there. To actually get to reaching an agreement through consultation, we encourage everyone to consult on how to consult. Consultation can take lots of different forms under NAGPRA, and it's important that both parties, or all parties really, discuss not only when to consult, but how to consult. It's critical that decision makers are identified, and any policy or procedure that might be in place at the museum or a university be clear to the parties involved. And lastly, certainly part of reaching an agreement through consultation is not just about one museum and one tribe, but there certainly could be multiple consulting parties, and possibly, likely, there may be multiple museums or agencies involved when we're talking about collections that might be split. And so it's important to kind of keep that broader approach to NAGPRA in mind. And one great way to do that is by applying for a federal grant. We award grants every year for both consultation and documentation projects, as well as for repatriation, the actual physical transfer process. So there are more information on our website about the grant opportunities under NAGPRA. To really get to making connections through cultural affiliation, again, it's important to realize that this is not the same as cultural affinity or continuity. There are requirements for cultural affiliation for sure, but they are very minimum. And again, the idea is to identify a reasonable connection, and that might take lots of different forms. I hope my diagram on here is useful. So sometimes you can have a straight connection between earlier groups and present day people. That's a direct straight line, but it can take lots of other forms, and there might be multiple connections. And that's okay. Under NAGPRA, there's provisions for that. And certainly we would encourage tribes to work together to form joint requests for repatriation. We've seen a lot of success in efforts where tribes come together and make joint requests based on cultural affiliation. And to get to the question, again, affiliation can be determined even if, say, two present-day tribes do not themselves share a relationship. But as the question asked, if there is a geographic location, could that be information to show affiliation? And we would say yes. If that's the only information available is the location, but that location was occupied by at least one earlier group, in this example, two. And there are present-day tribes that are connected to both of those or to one of those earlier groups. There is clearly a cultural affiliation that could be determined here between the human remains and funerary objects and both tribes in this instance. The question was, in what cases could ancestors truly be classified as culturally unidentifiable? Well, as geography is one of the lines of evidence and the requirement is to use available information, then geographic information should be enough to identify a cultural affiliation. In those cases where there is no information about geography, and I would go further to say where there is no information about collecting practices or really information at all, then those truly may be culturally unidentifiable. A good example of this that we often see are teaching collections where there's next to no information about where the human remains were removed from beyond their use in a teaching collection. And in those cases, they might be culturally unidentifiable. But as we know, a large majority of those human remains that have been classified as culturally unidentifiable, meaning that there is no connection to a present-day tribe, do have geographic information. And this is, again, where we would say at the Department of the Interior, by going back to that congressional intent to really looking at what's required for cultural affiliation and to establish that connection, it can be made through the use of geography. This is a suggestion for both museums and tribes, and this would go to, making an argument for a claim, and that is to really catalog the information that is available in each of these different lines of evidence, to show that there is information that traces that relationship to cultural affiliation. And then lastly, how do you actually do this preponderance thing? Again, it's important that in looking at whether something is more likely than not, in applying this effort to be impartial in reviewing information, that you give all information adequate consideration, and that you take into account the source and content of information to give it that weight. And again, remember that the whole purpose here is to remove some of the bias from this process. maybe, in certain areas of the country, it is generally found that there is no connection between, very early people and present day Indian tribes. And maybe that's a given in terms of academic thought or practice. But that's not the same as NAGPRA, and that's not the same as cultural affiliation under the law. Rather, there's an attempt here to remove that kind of bias and to look really just at what information is available and whether it is reasonable. Certainly in this process, you should not exclude information, but use all information. And any lack of information is not information. A zero is a zero. So if going back and looking at that list, if there's some of these places where it's blank, then that doesn't get weighed, that doesn't get considered in whether it's more likely or not. And again, the last line here, I think, is really useful for tribes and NHOs, especially in making requests, that information from a single line of evidence, for example, geography, can be a preponderance of the evidence. The preponderance does not mean some goal or some objective of information. It's just taking the information that is available and saying, is it more likely than not? A good way to kind of understand this issue and maybe dig in a little bit deeper are some of the review committee records where the review committee has considered questions of cultural affiliation or the identity of an object. And as you may know from your schedule, we actually have 2 review committee meetings scheduled this month. The first one is on November 12th. There is a link to information in the agenda for the conference. And then there's also a meeting on November 23rd. Both of those meetings start at 2 p.m. Eastern time, again on November 12th and November 23rd. And on November 23rd, the review committee will be considering a finding of fact. They will be making a finding on the question of cultural affiliation. So if you'd like to see this process occur by the review committee in their review, and this is one opportunity for you to do that. But certainly we have a lot of records, a lot of transcripts, as well as meeting materials of other efforts where these questions have come before the NAGPRA review committee, and they have applied the preponderance of the evidence standard to make a finding of fact on a particular issue. So that is kind of the end of my formal presentation. Before we open up again, I just want to remind everybody that, again, the purpose of NAGPRA, of this law and of this process and of this work that we're all engaged in is repatriation, is the return of ancestors and objects from museum collections and federal agency collections to Indian tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations. And certainly the intent of Congress was to encourage a dialogue between groups, but also to promote that greater understanding. And to certainly recognize and require that human remains must be treated with dignity and respect, human remains of any ancestry. But also that museums do serve an important function in our society. And I think that all of this together is sort of that future or that vision that Congress had for repatriation and repatriation work. And as Assistant Secretary Estino said in the opening remarks, in some cases we have reached that ideal, and in other cases we haven't. And just want to be sure I end with, again, the resources that are available on our website, and certainly the resources that are available on our team And here's a picture of all of us. And they're not all here on camera with me today, but they are all here. So our mighty small team in the National NAGPRA program is happy to help with whatever issues you might have. A lot of times people are new to NAGPRA, don't want to call the big bad federal agency, but I promise we're not scary. We're very helpful, and we want you to call, and we want to give you as much assistance as we can. And that includes for the next 40 minutes. It looks like we've got quite a bit of time. So we're happy to continue to talk through questions and answers. If you'd like to raise your hand and have a conversation, or we, as I told AIA, I'm here to serve you and you as attendees in this conference. So look, let's see if I can help. I think we have one other question I didn't get to in the Q&A, and that is, what happens when private collection is donated to Goodwill for resale? There's a lot of particulars that would have to be unpacked there. Certainly, it is a violation of the criminal procedures of NAGPRA to transfer or use for profit Native American human remains and funerary objects. So in that instance, certainly even a tax deduction for the donation could be seen as a use for profit in the case of human remains and funerary objects. In other instances, it's a bit more difficult to identify whether those collections are were obtained in violation of NAGPRA, and then what exactly the status of that private collection is. So I would say attend the enforcement panel next Wednesday to maybe raise that again, or to talk a little bit more in depth about when NAGPRA violations can be prosecuted or enforced, and when unfortunately they cannot be. But again, I would encourage all of you to learn more about the options for voluntary repatriation in those cases where NAGPRA may not apply.
Melanie, we do have some poll questions we could always do while people are considering what questions to ask you. And I guess I could put on my face here. And I also wanted to remind everyone that back in August, the Department of Interior released a draft NAGPRA regulation redo, a full comprehensive redo of the NAGPRA regulations, and provided that information to tribes for consultation purposes. So this may also be a good time to talk to Melanie about how you felt about those NAGPRA regulations, and ask her questions about that as well. Now, I'll go ahead and release a poll. Oh, they're gonna grade you right in front of you, Melanie. Here's the first poll. Did the material presented in the session, was it beneficial? There's 131 of you. I hope you all are able to vote. And also ask Melanie questions concurrently. So there's a couple of questions in the chat.
Yeah, I see that. The first question is if I could talk a little bit more about associated funerary objects, especially in cases where there are split collections. This is a topic that comes up quite often. And certainly, if you look at the definition of what is an associated funerary object, it's dependent upon the identification of the human remains with which the objects were buried. But those human remains do not have to be in the same museum as the objects. They may be in different museums, but certainly they are still associated funerary objects. So in the case of a split collection where perhaps one museum curates the human remains and another museum curates the funerary objects, the objects would still be associated, and it would be obviously preferable if the two museums could work together to restore that damage that was done in separating the human remains from their funerary objects. But in either case, even if that's not possible, tribes still have a right to request those funerary objects as associated funerary objects. And as I think most of you are aware, and again, for those of you who are new, certainly, I lost my train of thought. Associated funerary objects are, that's, as many of you know, there is a priority given to human remains and associated funerary objects under NAGPRA. They are required to be identified in an inventory and published in a notice of inventory completion once that cultural affiliation has been determined. So there is an emphasis in the law itself on those objects and ancestors to be returned as quickly as possible. We have another question about how does NAGPRA define profit? If human remains are used as a teaching collection, does that fit the definition of profit? It's a good question, although a bit complicated. There is no definition of profit in NAGPRA. You would want to look at the dictionary for a general definition of what use for profit is. It would really boil down to the specifics in a case. If objects are being transferred or sold or used for profit, that could be a violation of NAGPRA. It would depend on some of the specifics about those human remains. And then, of course, remember, the NAGPRA applies to Native American human remains. So that teaching collection would need to be identified as Native American human remains. But there's a lot more specifics that any kind of enforcement action would have to go into to identify that. So I would certainly, again, point you to that enforcement session on November 10th. There's a follow-up question along those same lines about whether profit includes selling replicas of human remains. A replica, I think, is, again, a bit more specific. And it would be the object itself that would be the question of any enforcement action. And I think, unfortunately, in the case of replicas, the object is not human remains as defined by NAGPRA, but a replica of them, and therefore would not necessarily fall into either the requirements for repatriation or a violation of the act. So a question here about who is responsible to find all of the split collections from one site. It's a very good question, and unfortunately, I do not have a very good answer. Museums and federal agencies are required to complete inventories and summaries for collections under their control. There's no requirement to unify collections that might be under the control of multiple museums that came from the same location. And it's unfortunate because this is a problem created by museums and federal agencies in splitting up collections. But there's no requirement under the law that they fix that problem, only that they repatriate. We've seen a lot of examples of tribes who have taken on that responsibility to identify those collections that have been split. But I'll say on the other side, we've seen cases of museums who have put that effort into unifying split collections. Again, it comes down to that available information, and that's the key to this puzzle. Certainly, information can help in putting those collections back together, even if it's just through a review of the inventories, and then ultimately physically putting them back together. Again, that's been a successful example of a NAGPRA grant, has been an effort to reunite split collections. There's another question on enforcement here. Does the National NAGPRA program take note of problematic institutions or museums and ever take action if multiple complaints are consistently made? At the risk of sounding like a broken record, again, I'd refer you to that panel next week on enforcement. But I will say that we investigate allegations of failure to comply. That's under the regulations. That is the process by which an enforcement action might be taken. And it's important to remember that a failure to comply is very specific, and it would come down to whether there is a failure to meet the requirements of the act. I often have this conversation, and unfortunately, often with tribes who ask me if a museum is out of compliance. And I have to respond that no, if a museum has completed its inventory and its summary, if it's conducting consultation, there may not be an actual failure to comply. And that may not mean that everything is being repatriated or that requests are being honored. And that's unfortunate, because I think that a lot of us would like to see a failure to comply, maybe in a slightly different lens of refusing to repatriate. But again, it's very specific and case-based in those instances where there might be complaints. Now, I will say that don't forget that there are other options for considering actions against a museum, or bringing to light issues that a tribe or NHO might be having. And certainly review committee is one of those methods. There will be, I think, other discussions during this conference about other avenues for activism around appealing to museums to take action on repatriation that doesn't rise to the level necessarily of a failure to comply. There's a follow-up here on the split collections issue and how difficult it can be, excuse me, to get the information needed or to have an institution even follow up on its own records. And then a comment on the cartoon that I have in my background. Certainly one of my favorites, and I have a couple copies. You can find it online. If you're new to NAGPRA, this is a comic that was written a few years ago, and yes, featuring Sonia Adelaide, who will be one of the keynote speakers. There's Sonia's cartoon image. I certainly recommend this to anyone as a great introduction to NAGPRA and to the NAGPRA process, and especially to some of the problems that you might encounter in the process. And thank you very much for posting the link in the chat so you can get your own copy. There's another question here. So there are a couple of questions. There's a question here about the timeline for the proposed rulemaking. Excuse me. At this point, I don't have a timeline necessarily. The department is carefully considering and reviewing all of the input it received during tribal consultation. And based on that input, we'll make decisions about what the next steps are. At this time, the department hasn't made that decision. But we're working on it. We received a significant number of comments as well as detailed input during consultation sessions, and we want to ensure that we're taking the time to thoroughly review it.
Well, something happened to Melanie. I'm sure she's going to get right back on. Let me go ahead and unleash some more polls so you can tell us how this session was for you. Am I hitting? There we go. I gained information that I'll take back and implement in my own work or share with others. There's 122. Let's see how many we can get to answer this poll. I should have come prepared with some jokes at this point. Anyone have any questions for me or about the conference? And please feel free to raise your hand and join me here on stage, either with audio or your audio and video. How are we doing? 73 votes. All right, y'all have done pretty good. Everyone's saying yes, there's no no's. I think that's wonderful. Let's go on to the next one while I have you here with us. Let's get this one. This session presented important directions or ideas for my repatriation work. Yes. By the way, if I haven't pushed it hard enough yet, I think Kim, our public affairs coordinator, is going to put a link for our Everything Back t-shirts. Please check them out if you didn't get a chance to get one yet. They're still for sale. And we'd love to have all of us with that shirt, making our voices heard about what everything back means to us. It is about healing and for all of us to come together in the values that we share with the land, the environment, with our children, with our cultural heritage, that we want everything stolen back. How are we doing? We've got 50 votes so far and a couple of raised hands. Oh, good. Sarah's going to join me here. Sarah Glass from the National NAGPRA program. Hey, Sarah.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes. What happened? What happened to Melanie?
I have no idea, but I thought I'd jump on and say hi to everyone. I'm not sure why my camera's not working. It worked earlier. Let's see.
Well, that's okay. Please introduce yourself and let everyone know what you do at the National NAGPRA program. There you are. Hey, Sarah.
Hi. Yeah, I don't know what happens. Sometimes Melanie gets kicked off if too many people in her house start using the microwave or jumping on video games and stuff. So I think we can all relate. Oh, here she is. Well, I just wanted to say hi and welcome everybody. And if anyone has any questions related to grants, I encourage you to reach out to me during the conference. I'll be in and out most of the days for the various sessions, and I'm happy to talk about funding opportunities for your NAGPRA work. So just wanted to pop on here and say that while we were hoping Melanie could jump back on. And I was going to start trying to answer some of the new questions in the Q&A too, but now Melanie's back, so she can do it. So thanks.
It's like my computer also had a dry throat and needed a moment to recover. But sorry about that. Thank you, Sarah, for jumping in. Okay, so there were some questions about new items, both a question about additional human remains discovered or a new summary item. These are great questions. Certainly in the case of additional human remains, there would need to be a correction to a notice if those additional items increase the number, the minimum number of individuals, or change the cultural affiliation. Whether you do a correction notice or a new notice would depend on whether the other objects have been repatriated. So if you still have the first collection, you could do a correction notice to add additional numbers of human remains or funerary objects. If the first notice has been repatriated and returned, then you don't want to open up the process on those items that have already been repatriated, and we would ask you to do a new notice for the new number of individuals. However, there is an option in NAGPRA in the regulations that clearly states if what you find are additional pieces of items or individuals that have already been identified in a notice, there's no need to do a correction. Those can be transferred directly to the tribe that was identified in the notice or that received the repatriation. For the case of a summary item, you do not need to submit a new summary letter if you find an object during consultation. You would proceed, obviously, with a notice of intent to repatriate for that object. And the only exception I would say is if consultation resulted in an identification of a new part of a collection or a new piece of a collection that maybe you previously didn't report in a summary, that you would want to then issue a new summary letter or invite tribes to consult on that new part of the collection. So it kind of comes down to what is identified in that consultation. If it's just a particular object, then you could move forward with the notice. If there's a change, though, to what, based on consultation, you consider to be Native American cultural items in your collection, you would want to be sure that you're informing tribes about that new part of the collection or new kinds of objects that should be included in a summary. Just looking, other than comments on how great the t-shirts are, it has been quite a first day. There's another question here about if an agency publishes a notice and determines affiliation with another tribe, even if we've already established in an administrative record of a different affiliation and that you've clearly expressed interest to repatriate. So this comes down to really NAGPRA being a case-by-case decision. Again, going back to that additional information, it's like my theme for today. If there's information that shows cultural affiliation to one tribe, but there's also information that shows cultural affiliation to a different tribe, then the museum has to consider all of that information. And they would need to consider their information for their collection, which might be different than, say, a cultural affiliation study or report or record that might have been in a different circumstance or for a different collection. That being said, though, what it sounds like you're describing then would become, would raise to the level of competing claims or competing requests. And then it is up to the federal agency or the museum in those instances to identify a most appropriate claimant. That's the language from the law and the regulations, is to identify that most appropriate claimant. And there's not a lot of guidance right now on how a museum would do that, other than, again, through evaluating the information that is available. And I hope that's a clear answer. I think the main point I want to make here is that really under NAGPRA, there's no precedent, right? So case-by-case basis means that each collection in each case needs to be considered for the information that they have. The comment is, the situation is that there's new staff and they didn't look into the previous consultation records. If you go back to my slide and putting it into practice, that's my number one tip, right? Well, number two. First is to review your inventories. The second is to look at your own records of consultation. Be sure that you as a museum are responsible. In this case, it doesn't sound like they were taking that responsibility on, but there is a responsibility for museums to keep track of their own records of consultation and to be sure that they are reviewing all information. And in this case, it's a federal agency. And again, there I would say there's even more requirements when we're talking about federal agencies and consultation requirements that exist, certainly for federal agencies through executive orders on tribal consultation, as well as other policies that might be relevant. It's always good to talk through specific examples. I think it really helps, especially people who are new, to hear these in kind of real world circumstances. Just a follow up there on this one. It sounds like, unfortunately, there is issues both with the federal agency and its own record keeping, but perhaps also with its ability to effective communication. And it, I think I would encourage a tribe in this circumstance to be sure that you're writing a pretty clear letter on your position, and certainly sending it both to the contacts that you're working with at the federal agency, but to be sure you're also reaching a decision maker if possible. There are so many there's so many challenges in this work. I certainly, we spend a lot of our day responding to those specific questions and cases and trying to offer assistance.
Hey, Melanie, while we continue to talk, sorry for the background noise there, I'm going to do a couple of more polls.
That sounds good.
This session challenged some of my understandings of repatriation practices. I sure hope so. Every time I talk to Melanie, I get a little more challenged.
Well, I'd say the same thing myself. Every time I talk about NAGPRA, I find a little bit different way to talk about it. And I talk about it a lot.
And I bet everyone who's answering no to this question is that small percentage of old timers and repatriation efforts. Nothing challenges them anymore. Thanks everyone for voting. I'm going to go on to the next one.
Sure, there's a question in the chat about identifying tribes for consultation. And, I think that understanding the history of your area or of the area that your collection is from can go a long way to assisting in identifying tribes to consult. Certainly, we can look to treaties and early contact records to assist in identifying those tribes that should be consulted. I often tell museums, universities in particular, who call to ask about consultation, and maybe they're in anthropology and aren't sure who to reach out to. I always encourage them maybe to start by contacting their own history department or a history organization that has a lot of information about this to assist them with identifying those tribes. I found that Wikipedia sure is very useful, and a lot of organizations have really a lot of information about people who lived and inhabited the places that we all live and work in today. And any source is a good source for starting consultation. And consultation can be a great source for identifying who you should consult with. It's again another question that you should ask the tribes that you do have identified, who else you should be consulting with based on the specifics of a collection. Well, I'm glad that lots of you have enjoyed this session. I'm glad that it challenged some of you. I'm very glad that it's going to impact your repatriation work and gave you information that you can take back. It certainly achieved the goals that I set for this session, and I hope that it has given all of you a lot of food for thought as we head into the next several weeks of this conference. Gives you something to begin this process and the next weeks we have together as we engage in more specifics around repatriation. I know I'm really looking forward to hearing from a lot of people that I don't get to hear from a lot, and really about issues maybe that go outside of NAGPRA, because certainly I spend my days deep in the weeds of what is required under NAGPRA, and there's certainly a lot of other conversations and discussion that we need to have about repatriation.
Everything bad.